The air at the Henderson farm auction hung thick and heavy, a humid August blanket, smelling of dust, diesel, and desperation. It was 1973, and you could feel a change in the wind. Not just the weather, but something bigger. Old man Henderson had finally given up the ghost, and his kids, scattered to the cities like dandelion seeds, wanted nothing to do with the life that had bent their father's back. So here we were, the farmers of Black Hawk County, circling the remnants of a man's life like vultures in denim and seed corn caps. I wasn't there for the household goods or the smaller implements. I had my eye on one thing, parked out behind the main machine shed, looking more like a monument to failure than a piece of equipment. It was a big bud, a Series 1 HN250, painted in a faded, sun-blistered white that was peeling away to reveal angry patches of surface rust. The tires, massive 24.5 32s, were cracked and sagging, one of them completely flat, the rim sinking into the soft earth. The articulated joint wept a slow black tear of hydraulic fluid. It hadn't moved in years, everyone knew it. Henderson bought it second-hand in the late 60s, ran it hard for 2 seasons before something in the big Cummins engine let go, and he just parked it. He didn't have the money or the heart to fix it, so it sat, a silent steel giant defeated by time and neglect. I walked a slow circle around it, my boots crunching on the gravel. I ran a hand over the cold pitted steel of the fender. This wasn't just a tractor, it was a statement. Built in Havre, Montana, by men who understood big country and heavy ground, these things were different. They weren't assembled by the thousands on a line in Waterloo or Racine. They were fabricated, welded by hand, built around massive truck components. A simple, brutal elegance. A Cummins NTC 855 engine, a 10-speed Fuller transmission, and Clark axles you could find on a Kenworth. To most folks, that was a problem. To me, that was the solution. Thinking of getting into the scrap business, Miller? The voice cut through my concentration like a stone through glass. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Franklin Hayes. He'd pulled up in his brand-new Ford pickup, the one with the Ranger XLT package, all chrome and two-tone paint. He stepped out, leaving the door open so we could all hear the country station playing on his 8-track. He was wearing clean pressed jeans and a pearl-snap shirt, his hands soft and uncalloused. His farm, just 2 sections over from mine, was a showcase of the latest and greatest. He'd just taken delivery of a brand-new John Deere 7520, the first articulated 4-wheel drive from the Green Giant. It had a soundproofed cab with air conditioning, a radio, and a seat that floated on air. It was financed to the hilt, of course. Franklin believed in what the bank and the farm magazines were preaching. Leverage. Use the bank's money to get big, fast. I just nodded at him. Hayes. He sauntered over, kicking one of the big bud's flat tires. A cloud of dry, rotted rubber dust puffed out. Lord Silas, this thing's an anchor. Henderson's Folly, they called it. You'd be better off bidding on that old Farmall M over there. At least you could get parts for it. Parts for this are sitting in every truck stop between here and Cheyenne, I said, my voice low. I tapped the massive engine block. That's a Cummins, not some proprietary thing they change every 3 years to make you go back to the dealer. Hayes laughed, a loud dismissive bark that made a few other farmers turn their heads. A truck engine, that's just it. This ain't a truck, it's a tractor. It's a homemade piece of junk. I heard the block is cracked clean through. You'd be buying 200,000 pounds of scrap iron. The rumor about the cracked block was exactly what I was counting on. I'd done my homework. 2 weeks prior, on a Sunday afternoon, when I knew no one would be around, I'd driven out to the Henderson place. I'd slipped into the overgrown weeds around the big bud with a flashlight and a pry bar. The story was that Henderson had run it without antifreeze one cold fall night, and the block had split. But the weep holes weren't cracked. I couldn't see any obvious signs of a catastrophic failure. What I did see was a thick black streak of soot running down from the number 4 cylinder's exhaust manifold right where it met the head. It looked like a blown gasket. Maybe a bad injector that had washed out the cylinder. A big job for sure, a dirty, greasy, back-breaking job, but not a fatal one. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Jerry, finally made his way over to the big tractor, his voice amplified by a portable PA system that crackled and hissed. "All right, gentlemen, here she is, the big one." Big Bud HN 250. Now we're selling this beast as is, where is. The engine is locked up, folks, we know that. Could be a boat anchor, could be your next project. What'll you give for it? Let's start the bidding at $2,000. Who'll give me two? Silence. The crowd just stared. $2,000 was a lot of money for something that didn't run, even something this big. My own tractor, a John Deere 4020 I'd inherited from my dad, was worth maybe $8,000 in perfect running condition. It was a good tractor, reliable as the sunrise, but our ground was heavy clay. Pulling a 7-bottom plow in the fall, I was running out of traction and horsepower. I needed more, but a new tractor like Hayes' 7520 was pushing $30,000. I couldn't stomach that kind of debt. My father's words were burned into my mind. The land gives, son, but the bank only takes. Come on, boys, the scrap price alone is worth more than that, Jerry pleaded. $1,000 then, can I get $1,000? A scrap dealer in the back raised a grimy finger. $1,000, Jerry's spotter yelled. I got $1,000, who'll give me $1,100? I let the silence hang for a moment, then lifted my chin. $1,100. All eyes turned to me. Hayes just shook his head and smirked, as if to say, there's a fool born every minute. $1,100 from Mr. Miller. Now we're moving. Who'll give me 12? The scrap dealer went to 12. I came back with 13. We went back and forth like that, $100 at a time. It was my entire savings account against his daily operating budget. When the bidding hit 2,000, the scrap man hesitated. He looked the tractor over again, calculating tonnage versus the cost of cutting it up and hauling it away. He shook his head. Sold, Jerry shouted, pointing at me. For $2,000 to Silas Miller. Good luck to you, son. I think you're going to need it. A few of the old-timers patted me on the back, the way you'd console someone at a funeral. Most just shook their heads and walked away, whispering about how young Miller must have more money than sense. Franklin Hayes didn't say a word. He just gave me a final pitying look, climbed back into his shiny truck, and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust and the faint sound of a Merle Haggard song in his wake. I stood there for a long time, just looking at my purchase. $2,000. Everything I had. For a broken, rusted 250 horsepower monster that nobody else wanted. My wife, Sarah, was going to kill me. But as I laid my hand on that big Cummins engine, cold and silent, I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't fear. It was purpose. Now, before we go any further, before I tell you about the nights I spent in the shop with grease up to my elbows and doubt gnawing at my gut, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever bought a piece of equipment, a car, a tool, anything, that everyone else called junk? Something that was cast aside and forgotten, but you looked at it and you just knew, you could bring it back to life. Let me know down in the comments what it was and how the story ended for you. I'm mighty curious to hear it. Getting the Big Bud home was a bigger ordeal than buying it. I had to hire a heavy-haul trucker with a lowboy trailer, another $200 I didn't really have. We spent half a day just getting the flat tire off, the beads rusted solid to the rim. We used sledgehammers, pry bars, and a whole lot of cussing. Then we had to winch it onto the trailer, the big tractor groaning and scraping like a dying animal. When we finally got it back to my farm and unloaded it next to the machine shed, it looked even bigger and more hopeless than it had at the auction. It dwarfed my 4020. It made my whole farm look small. Sarah came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She took one look at the tractor, then one look at my face, covered in dirt and grease. She didn't say a word for a full minute. I could see the worry in her eyes, the calculation of what that $2,000 could have been used for. A new water heater, maybe. Or the foundation repair we'd been putting off. It's big, Si, she finally said, her voice quiet. It's strong, I replied, or it will be. You think you can fix it? I know I can. I hoped I sounded more confident than I felt. The next morning, I was out there at dawn. The first order of business was to find out if Franklin Hayes was right, if I'd just bought the world's largest paperweight. I started with the basics. I drained what was left of the oil. It was black and thick as tar, but I strained it through a cheesecloth and looked for metal shavings. There were some fine particles, normal for an old engine, but no big shiny flakes of bearing material. That was a good sign. I pulled the valve covers. The top end was sludged up, but nothing looked broken or bent. The real work was getting to the head. The exhaust manifold bolts were rusted solid. I soaked them in penetrating oil for a day, tapping them with a hammer every few hours. Even then, 3 of them snapped off clean. I'd have to drill those out later. Finally, with a 3-foot breaker bar and a piece of pipe for extra leverage, the head bolts began to groan in protest. It was a full day's work, just to get the head unbolted. It was too heavy for my engine hoist, so I had to rig up a chainfall from the rafters of the machine shed. With a final metallic screech, the head lifted free. I lowered it onto a pair of sawhorses and scraped away the old gasket material, and there it was, just like I'd suspected. The firing on the number 4 cylinder's gasket was completely blown out. A black scorched trail leading from the cylinder to a water jacket. The cylinder itself had filled with coolant when Henderson shut it down that last time, hydraulically locking the engine. It wasn't a cracked block, it was a $50 gasket. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I'd won the first battle. But the war was just getting started. The cylinder wall had some light surface rust from the water sitting in it. I'd have to hone that out. I checked the head with a straight edge. It was warped, probably from being run hot after the gasket blew. It would have to go to the machine shop in town to be decked, another $150. And since I had it all apart, I might as well do it right. I decided to pull all the pistons and rods to check the bearings and replace the rings. It was turning into a full-blown in-frame overhaul. For the next 2 months, the big bud consumed my life. I'd do my chores in the morning, work the fields with the 40-20 during the day, and then spend every evening and most of the night in the shop. I sent the head and the injectors off to be rebuilt. I ordered a complete overhaul kit from a Cummins dealer in Des Moines. The parts came in heavy, oil-soaked boxes, new pistons, rings, bearings, gaskets, and 6 new cylinder liners, each one the size of a coffee can. The work was slow and meticulous. I cleaned every part in a tub of diesel fuel until it shone. I measured the crankshaft journals with a micrometer, checking for wear. I used a ridge reamer to cut the lip from the top of the old liners before driving them out with a sledgehammer and a block of wood. The sound of steel on steel echoed through the quiet country nights. Then came the delicate process of pressing in the new liners, which I'd left in our deep freezer overnight to make them shrink just a few thousandths of an inch. Each one slid into the warm engine block with a satisfying final thud. Neighbors would drive by and slow down, their headlights cutting a swath across my open shop door. I could see them shaking their heads. Franklin Hayes made a point of stopping in one afternoon. He was pulling a brand new 24-foot disc with his shiny 7520, the diesel engine purring quietly from within its insulated cab. He left it running, the exhaust puffing cleanly into the autumn air. He leaned against the doorframe of my shop, arms crossed. Inside, I was covered in grease, carefully torquing down the connecting rod bolts. "Still playing with your erector set, Miller?" he asked, a smug grin on his face. "Just about got her licked," I said, not looking up from my work. "You know," he said, his voice taking on a tone of false concern, "the Production Credit Association is offering some real good operating loans right now. You could trade that 40-20 in, get yourself a real tractor, and have your fall tillage done by the weekend. I prefer to own what I run, Hayes." "You can't build an empire by thinking small," he scoffed. "Land prices are going up. Corn's over $2 a bushel. A man would be a fool not to borrow every dime he can and expand. Get big or get out, that's what they say." "I'll take my chances," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. He just laughed and walked away. "Your funeral," he called back over the hum of his John Deere. I watched him drive off, effortlessly pulling a piece of equipment my 40-20 would struggle with. For a moment, a sliver of doubt crept in. Was he right? Was I just being stubborn and foolish, clinging to my father's old ways in a new world? I looked at the massive engine block in front of me, the clean new parts waiting to be installed. I was in so deep now, there was no turning back. I just had to trust my hands and my gut. The day finally came in late October. The last bolt was tightened. The fluids were filled. I'd installed 2 new heavy-duty truck batteries. I climbed up the steel ladder into the simple utilitarian cab. The seat was torn, the gauges were faded. There was no radio, no air conditioning. Just a steering wheel, a forest of gear shift levers, and a throttle. I took a deep breath, turned the key and pushed the starter button. The big engine turned over slowly, sluggishly. Roar! It coughed once, sending a puff of white smoke out of the straight pipe exhaust stack. I kept the starter engaged. Roar! Come on, girl. Another cough, then another. Suddenly, with a deafening roar, the Cummins engine exploded into life. It wasn't a smooth, quiet purr like Hayes's deer. It was a violent, clattering, angry sound. The whole tractor trembled, the 6-inch exhaust stack vibrating wildly, spewing a thick cloud of black smoke that blotted out the sun. The ground shook beneath me. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The years that followed were a blur of hard work. That first spring, I put the big bud to the test. I bought a used 32-foot field cultivator, something I never could have pulled with the 40-20. The big bud handled it like it wasn't even there. I could work down 100 acres in a day, the big Cummins bellowing its song of defiance across the valley. It wasn't comfortable, the cab was loud, the ride was rough, and in the summer it was like sitting in an oven. But it pulled. Lord, did it pull. And every time something broke, a hydraulic hose, a U-joint in the driveshaft, I could fix it myself with parts from the local Napa or a truck supply store. I wasn't beholden to any dealer, I was free. Meanwhile, the world was changing. The early 70s became the mid-70s, and farming was on fire. The Great Grain Robbery of 1972, when the Soviet Union secretly bought up a huge portion of the US grain supply, sent prices into the stratosphere. Corn hit $3 a bushel, then $3.50. Soybeans went to $10, then $12. It felt like the good times would never end. Farmers who had been cautious their whole lives were suddenly flush with cash and drowning in credit. The banks were practically begging them to take out loans. Land values doubled, then tripled. Franklin Hayes was the poster child for the boom. He used his soaring profits to borrow more, always more. He bought the 160 acres to the north of me, then the 240 to the east. He traded in his 75-20 for a new Steiger Panther, then traded that 2 years later for the biggest, baddest machine John Deere had ever built, the new 8630. It was a beautiful machine with all the latest technology. He built a new grain drying setup and a massive machine shed that looked more like an aircraft hangar. At the coffee shop in town, people spoke his name with a kind of reverence. He was a visionary, a king. I was doing well too. The high grain prices meant that for the first time in my life, I had real money in the bank at the end of the year. But I did things differently. Instead of borrowing, I paid things off. I finished paying for the 80 acres my dad had bought on contract years ago. I bought the 120 acres I'd been renting, but I paid cash, using the profits from 3 good harvests. The neighbors thought I was crazy. "You could have leveraged that cash to buy a whole section, see," one of them told me. "Instead of a new tractor, I invested in my old one." I spent a winter overhauling the big Bud's Fuller transmission, putting in heavier gears and bearings. I sent the turbo out to be rebuilt and turned the fuel pump up just a little, coaxing another 30 horsepower out of the old Cummins. I put new, wider tires on it. To everyone else, it still looked like a rusty old relic. But I knew what was under the hood. It was a solid, reliable, paid-for powerhouse. Hayes would see me at the co-op and just shake his head with a condescending smile. "Still running that old dinosaur, Miller?" he'd say, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I made more money this morning waiting for my new combine to be delivered than that thing's worth." I never said much back. I just nodded and went about my business. But I could feel the tide turning. I saw the looks on the other farmers' faces. They saw me as a relic too. A man stuck in the past, too timid to seize the golden opportunity in front of him. They saw Hayes as the future. He had the new iron, the big acres, the confidence of a man who couldn't lose. But I was reading the papers. Not just the farm journals that preached expansion at all costs, but the financial pages. I was reading about inflation, about the Federal Reserve, and a man named Arthur Burns, and then another named Paul Volcker. I was reading about interest rates. The word prime rate started appearing more and more. It was a number that had been stable for most of my life, but now it was starting to twitch, to jump. 7%, 8%. 10. One hot afternoon in the late summer of '79, I was in the shop, changing the oil on the Big Bud. The radio was on, playing softly in the background. The music stopped for a news update. The announcer's voice was grim. He talked about inflation being out of control and how the new Federal Reserve chairman was promising to break its back, no matter the cost. He said interest rates were going to have to go higher. Much higher. A cold chill ran down my spine, a feeling completely at odds with the sweat beading on my forehead. I looked out the open shop door, across my fields of healthy green corn, toward the horizon where Franklin Hayes's massive new grain bins glinted in the sun. They were full of last year's crop, held on speculation, all of it financed at 10%. My farm was clear. My machinery was mine. But I felt a knot of pure dread forming in the pit of my stomach, not for me, for him, for all of them. The party was almost over, and the bill was about to come due. The first sign of trouble wasn't a letter from the bank or a dip in the markets. It was the sky. The spring of 1980 started dry and stayed that way. The clouds that gathered on the horizon were thin and wispy, promising nothing. By June, the corn in my fields, which should have been shoulder-high and a deep, lustrous green, was barely up to my waist, its leaves curling inward during the heat of the day, a thirsty, pale shade of olive. The ground turned to concrete, and every pass with the field cultivator behind the Big Bud threw up a choking cloud of brown dust that hung in the air for hours. The old Cummins didn't seem to mind the heat. It just bellowed and pulled, the temperature gauge staying steady in the middle of the green. I, on the other hand, felt every degree. The cab of the Bud was a sweatbox. I'd have the doors wired open and a wet rag around my neck, but by noon the steel was too hot to touch, and the air was thick with the smell of hot diesel and baked earth. One afternoon, pulling the planter across the North 80, I saw Franklin Hayes in his big John Deere 8630, planting the section he'd bought a few years back. He was sealed inside his Soundguard cab, a cool, green bubble of comfort. He didn't even turn his head as I passed on the parallel road. He was in his own world, insulated from the heat and the dust, and, he probably thought, from everything else. The drought was squeezing everyone. At the co-op, the talk was grim. Yields were going to be cut in half, maybe worse. For me, it was a punch to the gut. It meant a lean year, dipping into savings, putting off plans to re-roof the barn. For men like Hayes, it was something else entirely. A bad crop wasn't just a lean year, it was a catastrophic failure to meet the massive cash flow projections their loans were built on. Their operating notes from the Production Credit Association were calculated on 200 bushel corn. We were going to be lucky to see 80. The first real crack in Hayes's empire showed up in July. I was cultivating a field of soybeans that bordered his property when I saw his 8630 sitting idle at the end of a row. A white service truck from the John Deere dealership was parked beside it, its utility boxes open like a surgeon's kit. Two mechanics in green shirts were huddled around the tractor's rear end, their heads disappearing between the massive dual tires. I finished my row and pulled the Big Bud up to the fence line, shutting down the roaring Cummins. The sudden silence was filled with the chirping of crickets and the distant clang of a wrench on steel. I walked over. Hayes was standing off to the side, his arms crossed, his face a mask of frustration. He was kicking at a dirt clod with the toe of his expensive boot. "Trouble?" I asked, keeping my voice even. He glanced at me, his eyes tired. "The hydraulics," he grunted. "One of the SCV valves is sticking. Won't lift the cultivator on one side. They've been out here for 3 hours. Say it's something in the control module, an electrical problem." I looked at the complex tangle of wires and solenoid blocks tucked under the cab. It looked more like the inside of a television set than a tractor. "That's a tough one," I said, meaning it. "Tough is the $400 service call," he snapped. "Plus parts, and I'm losing a whole day. This heat is frying these beans as we speak." Just then, one of the mechanics came over, wiping his hands on a red rag. "Mr. Hayes, we think we found it. It's the main logic board for the hydraulic controller. We don't have one on the truck. We'll have to order it from the regional warehouse in Moline." Might be here tomorrow afternoon, maybe the day after. Hayes's face went white. The day after tomorrow? You've got to be kidding me. Sorry, sir, it's a dealer-only part. Nothing we can do. Hayes swore, a low, bitter sound. He looked at his motionless green giant, a 30-ton monument to progress, sidelined by a piece of plastic and wire no bigger than his hand. I nodded to him and walked back to my tractor. I climbed into the cab, fired up the Cummins, and throttled up. The big Bud lurched forward, the simple direct lever hydraulics lifted my old cultivator without hesitation, and I went back to work, leaving him standing there in a cloud of my dust. The repair on his Deere would probably cost more than I'd paid for my entire tractor. The drought broke in August, but not with gentle soaking rains. It broke with a fury. A line of thunderstorms rolled in from the west one evening, the sky turning a bruised greenish black. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a freight train roar, tearing leaves from the trees and sending my empty feed buckets cartwheeling across the yard. Then came the hail. It started as pea-sized stones that rattled on the tin roof of the machine shed. Then it grew to the size of marbles, then golf balls. The sound was deafening, a relentless, violent drumming that went on for 10 solid minutes. When it was over and a cold, driving rain began to fall, Sarah and I stood on the porch, looking out at the devastation. My corn, already stunted and weak, was shredded, the leaves stripped from the stalks, the ears battered and bruised. It was a total loss, but it was the same for everyone. The storm had cut a 5-mile-wide swath right through the heart of our county. Franklin Hayes's farm had been directly in its path. His crops were gone. The collateral was gone. All that was left was the debt. The fall of 1980 felt like a funeral. The grain embargo Carter had put on the Soviets in response to the invasion of Afghanistan was still in place, strangling our export market. Prices collapsed. That, combined with the drought and the hailstorm, was a knockout blow. The interest rates, which had been creeping up, suddenly went ballistic. Paul Volcker at the Fed was determined to kill inflation, and he didn't care who got caught in the crossfire. The prime rate, the number the banks based all their loans on, climbed to 15%, then 18%, then an unthinkable 21.5%. Variable rate loans were a new thing then, sold to farmers as a flexible, modern financial tool. Franklin Hayes had signed them for every piece of land, every tractor, every bin. His payments, which were high but manageable at 10%, suddenly doubled. He was paying 20% interest on hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt with no crop to sell to make the payments. It was like being chained to a millstone and thrown into the ocean. The rumors started flying. Hayes was selling off his breeding stock. He'd missed a payment on his combine. The bank had put a lien on his grain. The confident swagger he once had was gone, replaced by a haunted, hollow-eyed look. We'd pass on the road, and he'd just stare straight ahead, his hands clenched on the steering wheel of his fancy pickup. The end came in the spring of '82. A small, discreet notice appeared in the legal section of the county newspaper. A foreclosure auction ordered by the Production Credit Association. The list of assets was staggering: 560 acres of prime farmland, a John Deere 8630 tractor, a 7720 combine with both a corn and a bean head, planters, discs, plows, an entire lifetime's ambition, all listed in cold black type. The day of the auction was grey and cold, a raw March wind whipping across the barren fields. The crowd was different from the one at the Henderson sale years before. The mood wasn't opportunistic, it was somber, frightened. These were neighbors watching one of their own go under, and every one of them knew how close they were to the same fate. They were looking at Franklin Hayes, a man who had been the very definition of success just 2 years prior, and seeing a ghost of their own possible future. Hayes was there, standing by the back porch of the beautiful ranch-style house he'd built, his wife beside him, her face pale and drawn. He looked a decade older, his shoulders slumped in his work coat. He wasn't the king anymore. He was just a man who had lost everything. I stood at the back of the crowd, my hands in my pockets. I wasn't there to bid on his equipment. I had my equipment, and it was paid for. I watched as his life was sold off, piece by piece. The auctioneer's chant, once a sound of excitement and opportunity, now sounded like a death rattle. The 8630, which had cost Hayes over $70,000, sold for $25,000. The combine went for a little more. The numbers were brutal, a testament to how far and how fast things had fallen. There was no way the sale of the equipment would cover the loans. The land was next. When the auctioneer moved on to the real estate, a hush fell over the crowd. This was the final blow. All right, folks, we're selling the land in 3 parcels. First up is Parcel A, the home 80 acres more or less, with the house, the machine shed, and the grain setup. A beautiful farmstead, folks. What'll you give? An executive from an out-of-state insurance company, a man in a crisp suit and polished shoes, opened the bidding. A few large-scale operators countered. The price climbed, but slowly. Land that would have brought $3,000 an acre 2 years ago was struggling to get to $1,200. I watched Hayes's face. He wasn't watching the bidders. He was staring at the house where he'd brought his wife as a bride, where his children had been born. I felt a nudge in my gut. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was something else. A sense of order, of how things ought to be. This wasn't right. I thought of my father's words, burned into my memory. The land gives, son, but the bank only takes. But the land also remembers. It remembers who worked it, who loved it. I stepped forward. The bidding had stalled at $1,300 an acre. $1,350, I said, my voice louder and clearer than I expected. Every head turned. The man from the insurance company looked at me with annoyance. Franklin Hayes's head snapped up, his eyes locking with mine. I couldn't read the expression on his face. Was it shock, hatred, confusion? The insurance man bid $1,400. $1,450, I said immediately. I had done the math 100 times the night before. I knew what the land was worth to a man who had no debt. I knew what I could afford. We went back and forth, the auctioneer's head swiveling between me, the quiet farmer in the worn coat, and the city man in the expensive suit. The rest of the crowd just watched, silent. When the bidding reached $1,600 an acre, the insurance man hesitated. He conferred with an associate, looked at his notes, and slowly shook his head. Sold, the auctioneer cried, his gavel falling with a sharp crack that echoed in the cold air. To Silas Miller for $128,000. A quiet murmur went through the crowd. I didn't acknowledge them. I just kept my eyes on Franklin Hayes. He pushed himself off the porch railing and started walking toward me, his boots heavy on the frozen ground. His face was unreadable. I braced myself for a curse, an accusation, anything. He stopped a few feet in front of me. The wind whipped his hair across his forehead. "Miller," he said, his voice raspy. "You came here to dance on my grave." "No, Frank," I said quietly. "I came here to stop a stranger from plowing it under." He stared at me, his jaw working. He looked from me to the house, then back again. For the first time, I saw the cracks in his armor give way, his eyes welling up. He didn't say another word. He just turned and walked away, a broken man on a farm that was no longer his. I didn't talk to him again for more than a week. I let the sale close, signed the papers that put my name on his deed. The whole county was talking about it. Some said I was a fool, paying too much. Others whispered that I'd done it out of spite, the final victory in our long silent rivalry. They were all wrong. One evening, I drove my pickup over to his place. My place now. He was loading the last of their personal belongings into a U-Haul trailer. His wife and kids were already gone, staying with her sister in Cedar Rapids. He moved like a man in a trance, his motions slow and mechanical. I got out of the truck and walked up to him. "Where are you headed?" I asked. "Don't know," he said, not looking at me. "Cedar Rapids, I guess. Look for work. Maybe I can drive a truck." "You're no truck driver, Frank. You're a farmer." He finally stopped and looked at me, his face a mixture of exhaustion and anger. "What do you want, Silas? You want me to thank you? You want me to congratulate you? You won. You got it all." "I don't want it all," I said. "I just want a good neighbor." I pulled a piece of paper from my coat pocket. It was a simple, one-page lease agreement I'd had the lawyer in town draw up. "I want to rent you the house and the machine shed. $1 a year." He stared at the paper as if it were written in a foreign language. "What?" "Stay here," I said. "You and your family. Your kids shouldn't have to change schools. Your wife shouldn't be separated from her friends. I took a deep breath, and I need a hired man. I've got another 80 acres to work now. I can't do it all myself. I'll pay you a fair wage. He looked from the paper to my face, searching for the trick, the angle. He found none. Why? He finally choked out. After all the years, all the things I said. Why would you do this? Because this is your home, I said, gesturing to the house. The bank doesn't get to decide that. We do. Neighbors. I paused, then added, and because you know how to run a John Deere planter better than anyone I know. I could use the help. For a long time, he just stood there, the lease agreement trembling in his hand. Then he slowly folded the paper, tucked it into his shirt pocket, and nodded. A single silent nod that spoke more than words ever could. He turned back to the U-Haul and started unloading the boxes he had just put in. Life found a new rhythm after that. Frank and I worked side by side. The first few months were awkward, filled with long silences. But the shared work of a farm has a way of wearing down pride. We fixed fences together, sorted cattle, and spent long hours in the seat of a tractor. He drove my old 4020 mostly, and I stayed in the big bud. He never complained. He was a good hand, a smart farmer, and slowly the bitterness in his eyes was replaced by a quiet dignity. He was a man paying his dues, and I was just a man who gave him the chance. The farm crisis eventually bottomed out. The 80s gave way to the 90s. Prices slowly recovered. Land values began to climb back. Frank and I became partners in a way. He managed the day-to-day operations, and with the money he saved, he started buying back some of his old equipment at auctions, this time paying cash. My own son, David, grew up during those years. He learned to drive on the 4020, but his heart was always with the big bud. He loved the noise, the raw power, the sheer simplicity of it. He'd spend hours in the shop with me, handing me wrenches, learning the guts of the old Cummins. One afternoon, when David was about 16, we were giving the bud its spring tune-up. Frank was there, helping us adjust the valves. David looked up from the engine, his hands covered in grease. "Dad," he said, "why didn't you ever buy a new tractor? Like that dear Mr. Hayes used to have, with air conditioning and a radio." Before I could answer, Frank spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "Because that tractor had a payment book as thick as a Bible, David. This one," he said, patting the big bud's massive fender, "this one came with freedom." I looked at Frank, and he met my gaze with a small, knowing smile. He understood. He'd lived both sides of it. I never got big. I never became a king. But I slept soundly every night. I owned my land, my iron, my future. The big bud, now faded and scarred from 30 years of hard work, still sits in my machine shed. The Cummins engine has been overhauled twice more since that first time. It's on its third set of tires. But it starts every time I turn the key, ready to do the work, its thunderous roar a constant reminder across the valley. A reminder that sometimes the things that look like scrap, the things nobody else wants, are the very things that will save you. It's a lesson written in steel and diesel smoke, a legacy of survival I was proud to pass on.